Welcome to this session. This is kind of a counterpart to the Reimagining India session that Tanvi did just before, which was a lot really focused on domestic Indian reform. Because of Ambassador Menon's background, this session is going to focus a little bit more on India abroad and the various alliances and policies that are developing. Tanvi, give it to you.
Thanks, Terry. And as Terry said, this is kind of the other part of the discussion on India that we're going to have, which is about kind of India abroad, India's engagements abroad, how the world sees India as well as India sees the world, and particularly some of the major power relationships. We have with us today somebody who, it couldn't be, nobody else could do this better. We have Ambassador Shivshankar Menon, who's one of India's most distinguished diplomats. He's served under a number of prime ministers and been head of mission in a number of countries: Israel, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, China, and also served as Indian Foreign Secretary, the senior most position, the bureaucratic position in the Indian Foreign Ministry, as well as National Security Advisor. And he's done, especially those last two roles, a very interesting time in India's kind of foreign policy history, but globally, a very interesting time globally and regionally as well. He is also the author of the new book, Choices, India Inside the Making of India's Foreign Policy, which looks at some of the major choices that India had to make that he was involved in, starting from the 1990s through quite recently, and the book is available upstairs. Given the subject of this conference, Ambassador Menon, I'm going to start with China, that has been implicitly and explicitly part of pretty much every discussion so far, and I suspect for the rest of the conference. You've written that we've seen an assertive China since about 2008, and that assertive China is here to stay. From the Indian perspective, how has this assertiveness manifested itself? You were in government at that point in 2008 as well. And what does this assertive China being here to stay mean for India in the future?
Yeah, well, just to put it in context, yes, I think you're seeing a more assertive China since 2008, but you're seeing a more assertive India too. You're seeing a more assertive Japan. I think the world changed after the world economic crisis. And if you look across the board, I mean, it's in Europe, it's in North America as well, you're seeing a form of, I don't know, hyper-nationalism maybe is a way to describe it. So I don't think China is an exception in that sense. But for China, for India, because they both changed so fast in the last 30 years, India, I mean, we've grown at an average of about 6.5% in 35 years. If you look at the last decade, it's an average of 8%. So, you know, the pace of change is so rapid. And it's that now these are much more confident states. And there's a much stronger sense of the future of India's place in the world. Same thing in China. You look at what you see on the net from Chinese citizens and so on. There's a much stronger idea of what kind of role they need to play in the world. But what's really happened, I think, with China is that China's definition of her core interests has expanded. And this is natural. I think China is more involved in the world. And for India as well, today we look at our maritime interests as being much more important to us. We import 80% of the oil that we use, and that's really a huge constraint on our growth going forward, is really energy. So as our linkage with the rest of the world, our interdependence with the rest of the world grows, I think it's natural that our definition of what's important to us also grows, and therefore the role that we try and play abroad also starts mattering.
Has, in terms of, not quite a core interest and not described that way, but perhaps the expansion or doubling down of China's relationship with Pakistan in recent years, how is that going to affect kind of India's choices vis-a-vis China, but the region more broadly?
Well, that's actually, it's a double consequence. In one sense, Pakistan's always been useful to China to balance India. And the faster India rises, the more useful it is, or more necessary it might seem in Beijing. But equally, as China steps out, into the world, tries and plays a bigger role in the Asia Pacific, she needs friends. And Pakistan's the only one apart from North Korea, the only ally really that she has in her immediate periphery that she can work with. So Pakistan's importance to China now actually has grown beyond just the India or the South Asia factor. And I think it's become much more serious. But it's a very old relationship. If you look at what China and Pakistan have been doing, you know, the Chinese assistance to the Pakistani nuclear program, for instance, right through, it's been to their missile program as well. So for me, that's become, therefore, one of the reasons why in India, China looks more assertive, as China increases her commitment to Pakistan. In 1996, December, Jiang Zemin, the president, went to Pakistan, stood up in the Pakistani National Assembly, and told them, you should do with India what we do with India, which is discuss your differences, whatever disputes you have, but don't let it stand in the way of developing a normal relationship. That's a very different advice from what I think we are seeing today between China and Pakistan. And that's why I think from an Indian point of view, at least, it looks much more assertive. The other is, of course, China's economic weight in the periphery that we share. I think that's something. And I actually think that now the old bilateral disputes we used to have, the boundary, for instance, basically I think we know how to manage those, the pure bilateral differences. But these are the larger, more difficult questions that I think we need to address. So I think the modus vivendi that we've lived with between India and China for the last 30 years, I think that's under strain now, with both countries trying to play a bigger role and, as I said, redefining their interests. And with the situation changing, with China-US strategic contention becoming reality and sort of polarizing the region. So once that happens, I think we need to find a new modus vivendi between India and China.
In terms of these overlapping peripheries that the two countries share, what has been the general kind of reaction, the Indian reaction? I know there are differences in India on this subject, in terms of China's Belt and Road Initiative.
Well, I think it varies. At one level, India has always argued for more connectivity throughout Asia. So if a road is only a road, fine. But, it's much more than just a road. Connectivity, it's not just means of connectivity. It has geopolitical significance. And it will have strategic consequences. There's parts of the proposal which pose particular problems for India. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor goes through Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, which is Indian territory as far as India is concerned. And so obviously that's something that we'd have not just legal but political problems with at home as well. For the rest of it, frankly, I think the government of India has said, we haven't really been consulted, we'd like to see what it is, and I think it's the geopolitical consequences that they really need to sit together and talk about between India and China and talk it through. Otherwise, if you look at it, the One Belt, One Road as pure economics, good. I mean, I don't think anybody would object to that.
I'm going to switch to something that came up yesterday, both in the session that you participated in, Asia 2030, and with Admiral Harris. He called the the growing US-India relationship the bright spot in terms of strategic issues. You said US-India relations they're the best that they've ever been. How much does that have to do with what we were just talking about, China, from both countries' perspective in your perception?
Well, I think it's more than China. I don't think it's just because of China or because of concerns about China's rise. Because frankly, we've been trying to build and transform this relationship for several years. It's been a bipartisan process in the US. It's been one at home as well, in India as well, across the political spectrum. And that transformation, if you look at it in terms of the politics, in terms of defense cooperation, in terms of, counterterrorism, maritime security, all the sort of Paul Mill parts of the relationship is booming. It's, as you said, it's never been better. But the other parts are equally important from an Indian point of view, whether it's, trade, the economy, the education. You look at the numbers of Indians who are in the US. Agriculture, I mean, the Green Revolution wouldn't have happened without the US. And for India, I think the relationship, the real test of that relationship is how it contributes to India's transformation. And that's our primary job. Our primary, in fact, the whole purpose of foreign policy in India is to help the domestic transformation of India. There's just too many poor people, sick people, uneducated people. We have big jobs to do at home. And that's going to take time. And I think that's the real criteria we'd apply to the relationship. And there it's remarkable. You look at trade, you look at what we do together, technology in every single area, health, medicine, energy, getting energy off grid to villages and so on. There are things going on between India and the US which I think are quite remarkable. But you know, they never hit the headlines because they're not, I don't know what's the word, sexy? You know, but if you read the newspapers, I think what admirals say in uniform always will catch the headlines and crowd these out.
In terms of another country that's been part of kind of we've heard a lot of making the headlines a lot, and we've heard of the bromance between Prime Minister Modi and Shinzo Abe of Japan. And the last year of the previous government saw a real uptick in activity with India and Japan, with Prime Minister Singh going to Japan, and then both the Emperor and Empress visiting India, but also Shinzo Abe himself going to India for India's Republic Day. What is behind kind of this uptick in relations, and where do you see them going, both in terms of strategic and economic terms?
Well, I think there's a long emotional connect with Japan. I mean, right all the way back to the national movement, the idea that here's an Asian country which modernized, developed itself, but didn't lose its soul, stayed Japanese, as it were, and that this is possible. I think that's very important to Indians, the idea that you can modernize, but stay Indian. You know, you don't have to lose your identity in the process. And if you look at it, India's behavior with Japan after the war, for instance, we didn't sign the San Francisco Treaty because we signed a separate peace with Japan. We said no reparations for whatever had happened. And it's been primarily an economic relationship right through the Cold War, when essentially the politics were dominated by global politics rather than bilateral. But throughout that, I think India has hoped that Japan would become a normal country like anybody else. So when Japan itself starts saying they want to behave like a normal country, the normal things that, you know, have a defense ministry, have armed forces, start operating abroad, I think that's something that India's always welcomed. So we've actually worked with Japan in these areas. We signed our first defense agreement with Japan in 2005. We signed the first MOU. 2008, we signed an agreement. We've been working on this for some time. We have the same interests in maritime security across the whole Indo-Pacific, the Indian Ocean all the way to the Western Pacific. Our energy needs, you know, we both import our energy along these sea lanes. We have, well, as Prime Minister Abe likes to say, we also share the same values and we both, I think when we started in '92 looking east, what Prime Minister Modi now says Act East, was also the time when Japan started sort of looking at connectivity and integrating with the rest of Southeast Asia much closer, much better than before, and started looking at India as part of that process. So it's really the logical culmination. Today, it's actually a very close relationship in many ways. It's in terms of we have common strategic interests as well, as I said, but it's also, of course, the economy, the complementarity. We have a free trade agreement between us, which is never easy to do, but we managed between two tough negotiators, but we managed it. So.
You mentioned maritime security, and I'm actually going to come back to trade. But before that, on the question of maritime security and the regional order, how does India see developments in the South China Sea over the last few years?
I think for us, we've been in the South China Sea since we've been drilling for oil there, for instance, from '87 onwards. For us now, almost 50% of our foreign trade actually goes through those waters. to the west coast of the US, to Japan, to China, because China is now our second largest trading partner after the US. So freedom of navigation there is very, very important. Also the principle that, you know, there is such a thing as international law which applies in these cases. I think for us that's also very, for instance, when it came to our maritime boundary with Bangladesh, we had a lot of disputes on the maritime boundary. We took it to the tribunal, and we both agreed beforehand that whatever they say, win or lose, we'll accept it and implement it. And we did last year, and we actually have that settled. We say that it's for the parties to settle whatever disputes they might have about sovereignty, about the extent of their claims in the South China Sea. But I would wish that they do it quickly and do it peacefully and do it, you know, in a manner which leaves freedom of navigation and leaves other people's interests also safe. And to that extent, we have a common interest with the Japanese.
Turning to the regional trading order, which you mentioned as well, as you said, it's always tough. India is a member of RCEP, but not of TPP. And there's been a question of opening up, which has concerned a number of countries in ASEAN, kind of renegotiating the India-ASEAN FTA. Where does the discussion about the regional trading order, given developments at the WTO as well and other countries' sense of what's happening there, where does that stand in terms of what India would like to see, or what you think this government might be seeing, where it might be going on this question of trade and its importance for India?
Well, I think if you look at it, India was the largest beneficiary after China of the 2 decades of an open international trading and investment system after the fall of the Berlin Wall, after the end of the Cold War, until 2008. So frankly, for us, an open, rule-based international trading system is the best. An improved WTO, in other words, and a successful Doha development round, because it would address many of the concerns that we have. We're not sure we like the idea of either plurilateral agreements, because those are agreements made by a small little group among themselves. It might suit their interests, and it's never as good for those who then join later, no matter what you can do, no matter how much flexibility you provide in it. Or for agreements that actually break down the global order into smaller little regional orders and into separate ones. So we're not really sure where this is going, this kind of, because there is, since 2008, a rise in protectionism, a fragmentation of the global economic, the trading system. And that doesn't work for us. We're not part of any group, any bloc. We are pretty much sui generis. And we have to see how we can actually deal with this. We'd like to see an open, inclusive RCEP and to see it as big as possible. But you know, what we like and what will emerge at the end of a negotiation is not necessarily the same.
I was just going to say on that, I mean, one of the questions that has come up again and again is, I mean, the issue, of course, of, you know, who's being protectionist and basically trading barbs, excuse the pun, on who's being protectionist. But the other thing that has been a major concern of India is labor mobility. And fitting that into kind of the broader sense of what we've seen for India at a time it is trying to grow. And is trying to have the kind of space that China had years ago. But it's happening at a time when you're seeing in the West particularly, but not just in the West, in countries like in the Middle East where Indian labor used to go, etc., that there was this sense that there's a, if not closing in, at least a discussion that seems much more protectionist than it used to be. How does this play into India's calculation in terms of what it needs to do given this external environment?
Well, I think one response is to double down on the major bilateral relationships that we have with the US, with China, with the big trading partners. Because that's one way around this problem. Because it's a fact, the world is being fragmented and large parts of it are closing down or becoming much more inward looking. But you know, we have a mirror of that argument in India itself. There are people in India saying, are these free trade agreements really working to our benefit, or do they just open us up to other people who are better and stronger and have managed to protect their industries when they needed to? That's a very hard argument to actually, but so long as, and I think if you look at the record over the last 20 years, we've done relatively well out of, so all you have to do is to point at the record and say it's worked for us so far. Yes, we can adjust to the going forward, but there is a political issue here because I think the BJP, I think its core constituency, one of its core constituencies, the ruling party, is a small trader community, is the mom and pop stores, the ones who feel the most threatened by an opening up of retail and so on to the outside. So there's a battle for their soul, which I think they have to sort out among themselves. And some of the noise that you see in the media and some of this, I think, comes from that argument.
I'm going to open it up to questions. If you could put your hands up, and we'll take one. Benji, right here.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, I had a quick question about Sri Lanka and the strategic importance of Sri Lanka, given that there's increased sort of relationship between China and Sri Lanka. There are new deep water ports that are being created, and from a military standpoint, does that scare India?
You know, China's been in Sri Lanka for a long time. I mean, I remember a huge fuss in India in 1967 when Sri Lanka exchanged rice and rubber, Sri Lankan rubber for Chinese rice, and you know. And China supported the Sri Lankans during the war, civil war, for a long time. For our problem is Sri Lanka's like, well, an unsinkable aircraft carrier 14 miles off the coast of India. So, you know, we worry what happens in Sri Lanka, whether it's a civil war, whether it's outside powers, whatever it is. But the answer to that is to work with Sri Lanka, to engage Sri Lanka, to actually be in Sri Lanka and work with the Sri Lankans. And I think we've done that fairly successfully. Our first free trade agreement in the region was with Sri Lanka. But I think we must also recognize that Sri Lanka, like all our other smaller neighbors, finds it useful to get India to pay attention and do what she wants by saying the Chinese are coming. And I'm sure they tell the Chinese the Indians are coming. So, okay, you know, and I'd do it in their place. But so what? I mean, I think we can live with this. This is an open, interconnected world where, you know, I mean, we deal directly with the Chinese. I don't think we need to be frightened of the Chinese. Obviously, if they were involved in ways that affect our security, we'd deal with it, but I think we deal with it straight with the Chinese, rather than trying to do it through the Sri Lankans and so on. And I think that's the way to keep that relationship healthy.
Other questions? I see one over there.
If you can tell us 2 or 3 of the biggest problems you think India as a nation has faced because of the fact that our foreign service has been generally pretty thinly staffed. Any opinion on that? Any top 2, 3 things we've missed out on?
We've missed out on?
Yeah, maybe opportunities or problems we've had because, you know, we don't have such a large foreign service. I mean, as an example, I think Singapore has as many diplomats as India.
Not really. We're
okay.
bigger than Singapore. We've doubled in the last 5 years, actually, and in terms of numbers. But I wish foreign services were so important that if you double the number of those foreign services, suddenly the country would run much better. And, you know, but in terms of, I think where we've missed out is there are bits of diplomacy which, you know, the newer bits of diplomacy, energy security, for instance. There are technology issues, for instance. These are issues which get more and more important to India as she develops. And those are the bits where I think we've actually missed out on because we just don't have the people, we don't have the numbers. So far we've been lucky. We can draw on society, at least when it comes to technology issues, to, you know. But I don't think we can do this for very long because it's getting more and more complicated. And now that you get into this whole business of climate change, and so it's really that intersection between foreign and domestic policy, where you're trying to negotiate externally, but you're also negotiating internally. You're negotiating, when you do climate change, you're doing a huge negotiation on manufacturing and energy at home at the same time. That's the bit, that linkage, I think, is the bit that we really miss out on because we don't have enough people who can actually qualify and do that job. But the numbers, you know, we went to cabinet when I was foreign secretary in 2008, I said, look at our numbers, and gave them the number, Brazil, Singapore, us. And so Cabinet said, yeah, what do you want? So I said, I'd like, 20,000. But so they said, but what can you actually do? And they said, can you double in a year, in 2 years? And I said, no, it takes time to produce a diplomat, to train one. So that's our real problem. I mean, it's not that you can produce these overnight. And that, so we've doubled in the last 5 years. We've done what, and I don't think there's any government, I think all the governments so far have said, if you want to increase, do it now. And I think they're in the process now of going back to Cabinet to increase the size again. But let's see.
We've got a couple of questions. One over here, Gunjan, and then one back there with David.
So India has a stated goal of having a blue water navy which can project its power far, far beyond the shores of the country. And I wonder if you have an opinion on the way that the country is going about doing it. In the Air Force and the other services, they are primarily buying foreign equipment. But India is choosing to design and build its own ships. And there's some concern that these ships, while they'll be large and they'll function, they'll be sitting ducks for the ballistic missiles that are now capable of attacking such ships. So I just wonder if you have any thoughts on A, the ambition to have a blue water navy, and B, whether it's actually feasible given the way India is going about it.
Yeah, well, as I said, I think as our definition of our own interests actually expands, as our dependence on the rest of the world, interdependence increases, I think it's natural that we look at maritime, a revised, if you look at the 3 maritime doctrines that we produced, starting in 2004, and the last one last year, each one represents a progressive increase in ambition. We decided, I think it's now 5 years ago, that all future naval hulls will be made in India. That doesn't mean that all the equipment that goes on them is Indian yet, or will be for the next 5 to 8 years. After that, maybe. I think the best judge of how vulnerable they are the men and people who actually sail those boats, because they're going to suffer straight away. And they don't tell me that they think these things are just huge, big, empty hulls which are going to be vulnerable. I hope they're right. But I think at some stage you have to accept a professional judgment about these things. I'm no expert on this, but as for the Air Force and the Army, I think levels of indigenization have actually increased in defense production for the Army considerably. For the Air Force, it's very hard to really measure. You measure value, dollar values have gone through the roof for that kind of equipment. The number of suppliers has also shrunk considerably in the international arms market. So it's not really comparable, I think, today's figures with earlier figures. But as proportions of budget, they're actually diminishing, the amounts. But whatever we're spending, more and more of it is being spent in the US. I think $10.2 billion?
More than that.
Yeah? On the US. So I think that's the part that's really growing very fast in the relationship with the US.
Okay, unfortunately we are out of time for questions, but thank you so much for
Great.
the interview.